You know what's crazy? One of the most prestigious championships in wrestling history was built on a complete lie. September 1st, 1979, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the Maracanãzinho Gymnasium. Over 12,000 fans packed into the arena to witness history. Pat Patterson versus Johnny Rodz in the finals of a tournament that would crown the very first WWF Intercontinental Champion. Except, none of that ever happened. There was no tournament. There were no 12,000 fans. There wasn't even a wrestling ring set up in Rio that night. And the wildest part? The reason Vince McMahon chose Rio de Janeiro for this elaborate fiction was because he thought it was hilarious that Pat Patterson couldn't pronounce it. I'm not kidding. For over 40 years, WWE has maintained this beautiful lie, a kayfabe so deep that even today, it's listed in the official record books. But tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of wrestling's greatest works. We're going to Brazil. Or rather, we're not going to Brazil because that's the whole point. This is the story of how wrestling's second most important championship was born from a prank, a French-Canadian accent, and pure creative genius. Welcome back to The Wrestleverse, where we dig deep into the stories that shaped professional wrestling. I'm your host, and tonight, we're investigating one of the most fascinating chapters in WWE history, the Intercontinental Championship. For decades, it's been the workhorse title, the proving ground, the championship that made careers and created legends. From Pat Patterson to Pedro Morales, Don Muraco to Tito Santana, Randy Savage to Ricky Steamboat, Bret Hart to Shawn Michaels, The Rock to Stone Cold, Steve Austin. But it all started with a tournament that never existed, in a country where nothing actually happened, witnessed by fans who were never there. And if you love deep dives into wrestling's hidden history like this, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. We're building the ultimate community for wrestling historians, and I don't want you to miss a single story. Alright, let's go back to 1979. Chapter 1. The Setup. The North American Championship. Let's set the stage. It's the summer of 1979. Vince McMahon Sr. is running the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. And like every territory in those days, they've got their world champion, and they need a strong secondary title. Thus, WWF had the North American Heavyweight Championship, and on June 19th, 1979, in Allentown, Pennsylvania, something real actually happened. Pat Patterson defeated the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, to capture that North American title. Now, Patterson was in his prime. The guy was already a legend in San Francisco, where he and Ray Stevens formed the Blonde Bombers, arguably the best tag team of the entire 1970s. Multiple NWA World Tag Team Championship reigns. They were that good, but Patterson won a singles glory in the WWF, and beating DiBiase gave him exactly that. The problem. Here's where things get interesting. Vince McMahon Sr. had a problem. Actually, several problems. First, the name. North American Champion wasn't unique. The NWA had North American titles. Other territories had North American titles. It wasn't special. It didn't stand out. Second, McMahon was thinking bigger. He wanted something that sounded more prestigious than just North American, but less than a world championship. He needed that sweet spot, a title that meant you were a main eventer, but still chasing that top spot. And third, and this is the part people forget, there was supposedly another championship floating around, the South American Heavyweight Championship. Now here's the thing, this title was also fictional. It never existed either, but McMahon saw an opportunity. If he could unify these two continental championships, he could create something brand new, something intercontinental, the creative solution. So they hatched the plan. They would announce that Pat Patterson traveled to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to compete in a tournament. In this tournament, he would defeat other competitors and ultimately face the South American champion, Johnny Rodz, in the finals. Patterson would win, unify both titles, and become the first ever WWF Intercontinental Heavyweight Champion. It was brilliant. It was simple. And it cost them absolutely nothing. Because remember, this is 1979. There's no internet, there's no social media, information traveled slowly. How would anyone in Pennsylvania or New York or anywhere in North America actually verify whether a wrestling tournament happened in Brazil? They couldn't. And more importantly, they wouldn't even try. This was the golden age of kayfabe, folks. Wrestling was protected. The business was protected. And if Vince McMahon said a tournament happened in Rio de Janeiro, then by God, a tournament happened in Rio de Janeiro. Chapter 2. The Rio de Janeiro Joke. Why Rio? Now here's where the story gets absolutely hilarious. Bruce Prichard, who worked closely with the McMahons for decades and has shared countless stories on his Something to Wrestle podcast, revealed the real reason they chose Rio de Janeiro. Pat Patterson was French-Canadian, born Pierre Clermont in Montreal in 1941. English was his second language, and while he spoke it well, he had a thick accent, and he absolutely could not pronounce Rio de Janeiro correctly. Vince McMahon Jr., yes, the Vince McMahon we know today, who was already working with his father at this point, found this absolutely hysterical. According to Prichard, Vince would bring Patterson on commentary for wrestling shows specifically so he could ask him, "Pat, tell us about when you won the championship. Where did you win it?" And Patterson, knowing he couldn't say Rio de Janeiro without mangling it, would just get frustrated and say Rio and quickly move on. This delighted Vince to no end. It was an inside rib that played out on television, and the audience had no idea. They just thought Patterson was being humble or dismissive about his tournament victory. But backstage, they were howling with laughter. Think about that for a second. One of the most prestigious championships in wrestling history is forever tied to Rio de Janeiro, because Vince McMahon thought it was funny to make Pat Patterson say it. That's such a perfectly wrestling reason for a creative decision. Not marketing research, not demographic studies, just let's mess with Pat. The announcement. On September 1st, 1979, during WWF Championship Wrestling, the announcement was made. Pat Patterson was introduced as the new WWF Intercontinental Heavyweight Champion. He had traveled to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He had competed in a prestigious tournament at the Maracanãzinho Gymnasium, the Little Maracanã. Right next to the famous Maracanã Stadium, in the finals, he defeated Johnny Rodz, who held the South American Championship. By winning, Patterson unified both the North American and South American titles, retiring both championships and creating this new, more important Intercontinental Championship. The commentary sold it like it was the most important thing in the world. Patterson held up the new championship belt. The angle was set, and nobody questioned it. The kayfabe details. Over the years, WWE has added layers to this kayfabe. In 2013, 34 years after the tournament, WWE published a story on their website with detailed results. They claimed that over 12,000 fans attended at the Maracanãzinho Gymnasium. They said Patterson defeated Butcher Vachon in the opening round. They even included a photo, supposedly from the event, showing Patterson and Vachon in the ring. They described how Patterson advanced to face Johnny Rodz in the finals, and in typical heel Patterson fashion, probably used brass knuckles when the referee wasn't, looking to help Rodz pin Ted DiBiase in the semifinals, ensuring Patterson wouldn't have to face his bitter rival. They maintained the story with a straight face, added details, made it seem real. This is carny brilliance at its finest. They're not just protecting the business, they're actively building on the myth decades later. Chapter 3. The Truth Behind the Fiction. What actually happened? So what really happened in September 1979, Pat Patterson was in North America. He was wrestling in WWF rings, defending his North American Championship. And at some point, Vince McMahon Sr. called him into the office and said, "We're changing your belt. We're calling it the Intercontinental Championship now." That's it. That's the whole story. No tournament, no trip to Brazil, no unification match. Just a rebranding. The North American Championship became the Intercontinental Championship because McMahon wanted a better name and a better story. And you know what? It worked. The Intercontinental Championship immediately felt more important than the North American Championship had been. The mythology gave it weight. The Rio de Janeiro story gave it international prestige, even though that prestige was completely fictional. Why didn't they just hold a real tournament? This is the question a lot of modern fans ask. Why not just hold an actual tournament? Well, several reasons. First, cost. Running a show in Brazil in 1979 would have been incredibly expensive for the WWF. International travel, venue costs, promoting in a foreign market where they had no presence made no business sense. Second, why bother? Remember, this is 1979. Kayfabe was protected. Fans believed what you told them. If you said a tournament happened, they believed a tournament happened. Buddy Rogers became the first WWF World Heavyweight Champion in 1963 the exact same way. A fictional tournament in Rio de Janeiro. Yes, WWE used the same fake tournament story twice. It was a proven formula. Why reinvent the wheel? Third, and this is important, it wasn't about the tournament. It was about the story. Wrestling has never been about what literally happens. It's about what the story says happened. It's about the mythology, the perception. Pat Patterson didn't need to actually travel to Rio and actually beat Johnny Rodz in front of 12,000 fans. He just needed people to believe he did. And they did. The legacy of the lie. Here's what's beautiful about this whole thing. The lie worked so well that it became truth. The Intercontinental Championship went on to become one of the most prestigious titles in all of wrestling. Not because of where it came from, but because of who held it and what they did with it. After Patterson, you had Pedro Morales, Ken Patera, Don Muraco, Tito Santana, Greg the Hammer Valentine, Randy Macho Man Savage, Ricky the Dragon, Steamboat, the Honky Tonk Man with his record-breaking reign, the Ultimate Warrior, Mr. Perfect, Bret the Hitman, Hart, Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, Diesel, The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Triple H, Chris Jericho. The list of Intercontinental Champions reads like a Hall of Fame roster, because that's what it became. The championship that proved you were ready for the main event. WrestleMania 3, Randy Savage vs. Ricky Steamboat, still considered one of the greatest matches of all time. For the Intercontinental Championship, SummerSlam 1991, Bret Hart vs. Mr. Perfect, a clinic. For the Intercontinental Championship, WrestleMania X, Razor Ramon vs. Shawn Michaels in the legendary ladder match. For the Intercontinental Championship, the belt that was born from a lie became the belt that made legends. Chapter 4. Pat Patterson's real legacy. More than a champion. While we're having fun with the Rio de Janeiro myth, let's not forget who Pat Patterson actually was, because the guy was a genuine wrestling genius. Yes, he was the first Intercontinental Champion, even if the origin story was fake. But his real contributions to wrestling went so far beyond that. After retiring from regular in-ring competition in 1984, Patterson became one of Vince McMahon's top creative minds. He became what they call a finish man, someone who specialized in creating the endings to matches. Bret Hart, one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, once said that Pat Patterson was the most creative person in the history of wrestling in putting a finish together. Coming from Bret Hart, that's not just a compliment, that's a Hall of Fame endorsement. The Royal Rumble. But Patterson's greatest creation wasn't the Intercontinental Championship, it was the Royal Rumble. In 1988, WWE was looking to counter-program Jim Crockett Promotions' Bunkhouse Stampede pay-per-view. They needed something special for a 3-hour USA Network special. Vince turned to Pat and said, "Pitch them that idea of yours." Patterson had been thinking about a different kind of battle royal, something more structured, more dramatic, where wrestlers entered at timed intervals instead of all starting at once. Dick Ibersol, the president of NBC Sports, loved it immediately. Patterson went home and wrote the entire first Royal Rumble by himself that night. The format, the structure, the drama of the countdown, the eliminations, all Pat Patterson. the Royal Rumble became one of WWE's most important annual events. It's been running for over 35 years now, creates WrestleMania main events, it's launched countless careers, and it was Pat Patterson's baby. The Attitude Era stooge, Patterson also had a second act as an on-screen character during the Attitude Era. He and Gerald Briscoe played Mr. McMahon's stooges. Yes, men who did Vince's dirty work. They were comic relief, sure, but they were also part of one of the hottest angles in wrestling history with Stone Cold Steve Austin. In 2000, at King of the Ring, Patterson competed in an evening gown match against Briscoe for the Hardcore Championship. That's right, Pat Patterson, at 59 years old, wearing an evening gown, fighting for a championship. He actually won the Hardcore Championship that night, becoming one of the oldest champions in WWE history. And then in 2019, yes, 2019, Patterson won the WWE 24/7 Championship, making him the oldest champion to ever hold a WWE title at 78 years old. The guy's last championship reign happened when he was 78. That's incredible. Breaking barriers. We also need to acknowledge that Pat Patterson was the first openly gay wrestler in WWE history. In an industry that wasn't always accepting, in an era that was even less accepting, Patterson lived his truth. He never hid who he was, and while he faced discrimination and challenges, he also paved the way for future LGBTQ+ wrestlers. When Patterson passed away in December 2020 after a battle with cancer, the outpouring of love from the wrestling community was overwhelming. Wrestlers from every generation shared stories about how Pat helped them, taught them, guided them. He wasn't just a wrestler or a creative mind. He was a mentor, a teacher, a legend. Chapter 5. The Broader Pattern. Wrestling's Relationship with Truth. The Rio de Janeiro myth isn't unique in wrestling history. It's actually part of a larger pattern of how wrestling creates mythology. Buddy Rogers, as I mentioned earlier, won the first WWF Championship in a tournament in Rio de Janeiro in 1963. Also fictional. Andre the Giant was billed as undefeated for 15 years before WrestleMania 30, even though he'd lost matches plenty of times. The Undertaker's streak at WrestleMania became mythological, but it only became the streak retroactively. Nobody was really counting until it became a storyline. Wrestling thrives on mythology, on larger-than-life stories that feel true even when they're not literally true. Why we love it, and here's the thing, we don't mind. Wrestling fans have a unique relationship with kayfabe. We know it's predetermined. We know the stories are constructed, but we choose to engage with the mythology anyway because that's where the magic lives. When we watch a documentary about the Rio de Janeiro tournament, we're not mad that it didn't happen. We're appreciating the audacity of the story, the commitment to the bit. WWE maintained that kayfabe for over 40 years. They added details. They published photos. They built on it in 2013 with that fake tournament report. That's not lying to the audience. That's respecting the mythology. That's protecting the magic. The Intercontinental Championship today. Today, the Intercontinental Championship continues to be defended on WWE programming. The current lineage goes all the way back to September 1st, 1979, when Pat Patterson defeated Johnny Rodz in Rio de Janeiro. Even though everyone knows the story is fake, it doesn't diminish the title. If anything, it adds to its charm. Every champion who holds that belt is part of a lineage that began with one of wrestling's greatest works. They're continuing a tradition that started with a joke about a French-Canadian accent and a city name. That's beautiful. What we can learn. The Rio de Janeiro myth teaches us something important about professional wrestling. Truth isn't what literally happened. Truth is what the story says happened. Pat Patterson is the first Intercontinental Champion. That's true. He won a tournament in Rio de Janeiro. That's false. But the mythology of that tournament is what gave the championship prestige. The story is what mattered. In wrestling, the story is always what matters. So there you have it, the truth about the Rio de Janeiro myth. There was no tournament. There was no trip to Brazil. There was no unification match in front of 12,000 fans. There was just Vince McMahon wanting a better name for his secondary championship and finding it hilarious that Pat Patterson couldn't pronounce Rio de Janeiro. From that joke, from that creative decision, from that beautiful kayfabe, came one of the most prestigious championships in wrestling history. Pat Patterson didn't need to actually win in Rio to be the first Intercontinental Champion. He just needed the story to be told. And for over 45 years, that story has been told. It's been protected. It's been built upon. Because in wrestling, the story is the truth. And that's why we love it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into wrestling mythology, do me a huge favor. Subscribe to the Wrestleverse right now. We're building the ultimate archive of wrestling history. The stories behind the stories, the truth behind the kayfabe. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me your favorite Intercontinental Championship reign. And check out our other videos where we explore the hidden history of professional wrestling. Until next time, keep the kayfabe alive, and I'll see you in the Wrestleverse.